guys, this is Lauren Harpster from Bead and Blossom, and today I am back with an update on my French beaded pine tree project. Now, in the first video in this series, I talked about kind of what I'm making, the inspiration behind it, and I also showed you guys the beads and bead mixes that I chose for this project. If you like watching people mix beads together, that is a great video, and I will put a link in the description below if you want to watch it. Now in this video, I'm going to be talking about these samples that I've made while working through the patterns that I want to use for all of my branches. Now, just as a reminder, this is a personal project. I'm not really intending this to be a tutorial, so I'm not going to be demonstrating any of these things here on camera, but I wanted to do a video documentation just to kind of, document the project, the progress behind it, the things that I chose. And hopefully you guys will have a little bit of fun with this as much as I am. And maybe you'll get some inspiration for another project or just have some fun watching me attempt to make a 2-foot pine tree out of beads and wire. Alright, so we're going to look at my needle samples first. I've actually published 2 beaded pinecone patterns before. The first one I published, it was either the 3rd or 4th pattern that I ever put out there, and it was a little bit more beginner friendly. The second one I published last year in my French beaded Christmas wreath book. It's a little bit harder pattern, uses a little bit more difficult techniques, difficult shading patterns, but I've kind of taken ideas from both of those patterns and altered them and mixed them together for my pine tree project. Now for the needles, I specifically took ideas from the second pattern. I'm working with the continuous loop technique. Now I chose this technique because it's easy and it's fast to do. I can make a bunch of them really quickly, and I don't even know how many loops I'm making, but I'll keep count and I'll tell you at the end after I'm done with this tree how many loops are in it. But I'm assuming it's going to be thousands, or if not tens of thousands of loops. Now the downside of this technique is that it does make your needles thicker than they would be on a real tree. And let me show you here. I made this a couple years ago. It's just a small sample of a branch that I was playing with. And I used a fringe technique to make the needles. And you do get this really thin, nice looking needle. Now these branches are a little bit they're too dense with the needles. I should have made less needles. But I just want to show you the technique here. It gives you thinner needles, but it's really tedious. And I don't like it. I don't want to have to make that many needles or that many fringes. I didn't make my branch any larger than this because I was really, really done with those fringes. So I went back to my continuous loop technique, and I decided, that's definitely what I'm going to do for this tree because I don't want to cry while I make this tree. So I worked with a continuous loop technique, and one of the things that I used in my second pinecone pattern was kind of an optical illusion a little bit to help make my needles look thinner. And I did that by making half of my loop white and half green. And that gives you the illusion that frost has accumulated on top of a thin needle. And that's why I used that shading pattern. So as I was working on samples for this tree, that was the first thing that I wanted to try. So my needles are a little bit shorter than the ones in my second pattern. And I thought that would work a little bit better with this tree than those really long ones. But I used the same shading pattern, white and then green. And I was able to pre-string all these beads right onto my spool, just 1 inch of white, 1 inch of green, over and over and over again, and then I could just fold the white and green together. Don't have to measure twice or anything for these loops. So that made it really fast and made it really easy. And I really like the mix of beads that I used for my white. I used a size 11 and a size 8 bead mixed together, and I like the effect that has because it kind of gives you an uneven frost layer. Instead of having just a smooth 11-0 layer there, you get kind of a bumpy texture to it. And I really like that. And I like the beads that I used in the mix. However, after I made this sample, I kind of looked at it and I thought that's going to be too much white on a whole tree. For a small branch, it would probably be okay, but on a whole tree, that's just a whole lot of white. And so I need to reduce the amount of white. How can I do that? So my next trial was this one. And what I did is I decided to make a mix of my green and white beads together. And then I used that same idea of, half white green mix and then half green mix. And folded those in half and made my loops with that. And you know, I think this shading pattern would work fairly well for a smaller scale project, but I think on a tree the size that I'm making, it's just going to look like a speckly tree. And so I kind of, I decided that that one wasn't the way to go. So my third one is actually the one that I've decided to move forward with, but the downside is that it's a little bit harder to do. With these two, I could pre-string from the spool onto my spool and then work off the spool without having to measure and cut any wire. But with this one, I actually did, just due to the shading pattern and how different it is for each loop, I did actually have to cut wire and add beads for each loop. But the difference is that I have my white beads just at the ends of the loops. And I think that that makes it look a little bit nicer. It's less exact like this one is with, you know, half white, half green, the same amount of white, same amount of green for every loop. A little too measured looking. This one I think looks a little bit more natural. But I had a different amount of white for each loop. So this one here has a lot of white. And then this one here just has a little bit of white. And then I had some that were actually all green. Maybe the snow missed that one as it was falling. And then I had some where I used the mix instead of the white. So I used a little bit of the mix and green. And then I also had some, let me find one here. I had some where I used the green, the white, and the mix. And I think that that looks really nice too. Because snow doesn't fall evenly. It doesn't just fall on one big chunk or one big line. There might be little specks of snow a little bit further down the pine needle. So this is the shading pattern that I'm going with. Now this has 21 loops in it in this little branch, and this is just a little side branch. That's about 42 inches of beads. I don't really want to do the math on. I had to figure out how many grams that is. But I'm sitting here looking at my little bucket of green beads that I've got, and I'm wondering if I even bought enough beads for a 2-foot tree. You know, that's not a huge problem. I was really hoping that I could just work with the beads that I have so I wouldn't have to buy any more. But, you know, I'm not scared of buying beads. I'm really good at buying beads, actually. So, you know, if I have to, I will. I know where to get them. I know which ones I used, and that's okay, but it's a little bit of a bummer. Okay, now let's look at these pine cones. Now, for this tree, I'm making about a 2-foot tree, somewhere around there. I'm not exactly sure how many pine cones I need, but I'm thinking it's going to be somewhere around 30, maybe more pine cones for this tree to make it look, you know, not just a plain tree, but I want plenty of pine cones on it. So I'm looking at making a crap ton of pine cones, and I'm saying, you know, I should probably work with an easier technique. So I looked at my first pattern, which uses beginner level techniques, specifically the wraparound loop technique, and I decided that I would go with something like that. But I wanted to change both the size and the shape of the pine cone, so I had to fiddle around a little bit. Okay, so I settled on the wraparound loop technique, but I had to at least try something else to make sure that I wouldn't doubt myself later or want to alter things later. I wanted to at least try the crossover loop technique. And the reason I wanted to try this is because with wraparound loops, you actually have the potential for those loops to be separated in each scale. I can easily just bend back one of those loops and then it's separated from the center loop. And so that's actually why the wraparound loop is not my favorite technique. I would prefer to use a continuous basic frame because they're all attached together that way. So I wanted to at least try a crossover with these, but because I'm working with both size 8 and size 11 beads, it was actually very difficult to do. I couldn't always measure out my crossovers very well. Like there's some places where I couldn't add in an extra bead easily without having to cut the wire and add a smaller bead on myself, and that it just made it a little bit harder to work with. But it also, you having these thicker beads at the top made it so I couldn't flatten my rows of my continuous crossovers very well. Normally I flatten my petals so that they're side by side instead of, you know, kind of bunched up on top of each other, and I couldn't do that very well with my thicker size 8 beads, and so I ended up with this scale that was really thick at the top and it felt a little bit more bulky. So the wraparound loop has a much thinner profile there, less thickness, less bulkiness, and I think it just looks better for a smaller pine cone. But I'm glad I tried it because now, you know, I don't have to worry about it later saying, hey, maybe I should use a crossover. Nope, I should not have. Okay, so let's look at some of these other components that I made here. Now my original pattern had something similar to this for the tip unit right at the top of the pine cone here. It has continuous loops and then wraparound loops around it. And I just kind of decided, you know, after making this and a couple of other components and put them together, that these scales, I needed more of the smaller scales at the top instead of going small to immediately to a thicker scale. So I switched to doing just continuous loops for the tip of my pine cone, and this is the first unit that I decided on for right at the tip of my pine cone. Okay, now the next component I tried was also, again, very similar to my first Pinecone pattern, but I kind of decided that these scales were too short and that I needed longer ones to go and look a little bit nicer with these continuous loops. So I switched to a longer wraparound loop, but also a 2-row, and I thought that looked a little bit better with my pine cone. Okay, now for the next unit up, in my first pinecone pattern, I actually start switching to a 3-row wraparound loop, which just makes thicker scales. But I decided if I want to miniaturize my pinecone a little bit, that having those thicker scales didn't work quite as well. So I altered this one also to a 2-row wraparound, and I decided to use that same size scale for the rest of the components. So basically what I've done here, I've got continuous loops at the tip, and then I switched to a 2-row wraparound, and then I had 4 of those in the first unit, 5 in the second, 6, 7, and then to kind of taper down in size at the bottom of my pine cone to round out the bottom, I switched back to a 5 scale unit for the bottom. Now, after I made the large one, I thought, you know, maybe I should try making a smaller one. Maybe that'll help make my tree look a little bit more natural, give me a little bit more variety in my tree, and also help so I don't have to make quite as many of those wraparound loop units. So I made a smaller one as well, just by leaving off a couple of layers. Now this one is about 2 inches long, and this one is like 1.5 or 1 3/4 inches long, somewhere between there. Just like my needles, I really liked having the different sizes of whites at the tip of my pinecone scales. I thought that looked really nice. It just gives you an uneven layer of snow rather than a flat layer of snow. But I also like the bead mixes that I used. I don't know if you're going to be able to see them very well on camera, but I like that I used different whites. I think that makes it, gives you a little bit more depth. Some of them are a little bit more sparkly than others, so you get a little bit of sparkle as you move around. And then some of them are flatter, and some of them are slightly transparent. I got those Ceylon beads that are slightly transparent, and then opaque beads as well. And I really like that mix, but I also really like the mixes that I used for my brown and my greens. I don't work with a lot of mixes in my flowers, but I wanted to try it with this tree because otherwise it's just a flat brown or a flat green or a flat white. And having different browns in there gives you a little bit more interest, a little bit more sparkle, a little bit more depth of color, and just, you know, it just makes it so it's not flat. So I really like that I used different finishes of beads in my mixes. I did that with my greens as well. I don't know if you were able to see that very well in the video, but I've got some transparent matte, and some transparent rainbow beads in there. But anyway, so there's the trials that I did. Those are my samples. And there's one little bit, my next step is actually to make some branches, but I have to do some things before that. So I'm going to talk about one more thing before we go. Okay, so my next part of this project is actually to do some studying. I need to make branches, but I don't know exactly how long I need to make my branches or how many branches I'm making for this dang tree. So I went out and I bought a little pinecone tree. I bought a little fake tree. Now, we all know that I'm really bad at reading the measurements on the listings, which is how I ended up with a very large bear pot. I thought it was a lot smaller. That's the whole reason I'm making this tree, is because I can't read the measurements on listings, and I did the same thing with this tree again. I thought I was buying a tree that was 2 feet tall, but they meant with the stand included. So the tree that I'm studying is only 18 inches tall, but I'm pretty sure I can still figure out the ratio of, you know, branch lengths and how many branches per layer from this tree. So I'm going to be studying this one, measuring all the branches, figuring out how many branches I need to make. I'm hoping my tree will be kind of fluffy like this one. I don't know if it's going to be quite as full looking, but I'm shooting for something similar to this shape and fluffiness. All right, now I also got the tree to make sure that the size would look good with the pot. Because nothing like making a 2-foot tall pine tree and then figuring out that it's too big and I could have left off a layer of branches. So I've been testing this against the size of my pot, and I think it's a pretty decent size, especially if my tree is going to be a little bit larger. I think the 2 feet is going to be a nice size to shoot for with this one. All right, now I have some concerns that are going to need to be addressed in this next stage. Now, if you've ever done French beading before, then you know that the projects tend to get really heavy, and you have to make sure that you have enough support to them. Now, this tree is probably going to be one of the heaviest projects I've ever made so far. So I have to figure out how to make sure that I have enough support not only for each individual branch, but for the tree as a whole. And that's something that I need to think ahead and plan for before I make all of my branches. So I have some ideas that I'm going to be testing, and I'm going to be covering that and my branches and everything in my next video. Anyways, I'll see you guys next time. Happy beading!